Hey everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Please take a second to rate, follow, or subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator and helps us reach even more people. Now here's what we've got in store for you today.
We investigate not to blame but to learn. That's the real drive here, because we want to make it safer for the next person. One thing you have to learn very quickly is humility. No matter how good we are, how good we think we are, we can easily be the weak link. When you talk to human factors experts, they will say to you, oh, no, Martin, human factors isn't about human error. It's about designing the system so that we can optimize human performance. And yeah, that's true. And academically, that's wonderful. But when you're sitting there in a real situation, it's about saving your ass, keeping alive and not screwing up. It doesn't matter, what business you're in, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a firefighter, whether you're a pilot, you want to have systems there that help you to get it right and make it easy to get it right and hard to get it wrong. And that's really the science of human factors and ergonomics. And you might be the most innovative, brightest entrepreneur, but you can't possibly have an awareness of how all these things around you might affect you. So the ability to just ask open questions is so powerful.
The Firefighters Podcast is a global podcast seeking to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operators. Through a series of wide-ranging conversations celebrating those within our sector, we seek to encourage and support this incredible group of people. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield, and I speak with individuals from all walks of life who I sincerely believe can add value to or develop those who have chosen this life path. Please support your emergency services wherever you are in the world, and thank you for listening. I want us to change gears and get into the real depth of what I wanted to discuss today, because just give us a quick background in the aviation side of it. Have you always, when did you first become a pilot? What's your background?
So I came into flying quite late in my life. So I had a variety of jobs, clerical jobs. I ended up in a leadership role. I then ended up training other people to be leaders. So I developed a kind of a training and development role, but flying was always what I wanted to do.
So what age were you, if I could ask? Sorry.
So I started, I qualified as a private pilot when I was 29. That was just flying for fun. But then I went and got myself a medical to prove that actually I could have the right category of medical to be an airline pilot. And then that was the decision made, really.
Because one of your children's training to be a pilot now.
Yeah, that's right. So Victoria's training now.
What are the highlights of that How does somebody do that? Because it's quite expensive, a long process.
Yeah,
maybe it's not expensive. From my limited interpretation, it is expensive.
It is expensive, yes. And I can't even. Yes, you're talking about a minimum of 45 hours flying, but probably 60 or so. You're talking, paying £150, maybe £200 for those hours, depending on where you learn.
Yeah. And there must be guided learning as well from a qualified instructor. So there's a logistical challenge to if you're even close enough.
Yeah.
You could be travelling hours just to have these
Well,
lessons.
luckily there's airfields. Most counties, the one that Victoria's learning at is only 30 minutes away from here. So that's quite nice. But I think one of the things
helps having your dad as a pilot as well.
I suppose it does. But I think interestingly, it's expensive. But if you really want to do it, you will find a way. But not only that, it's one of those things that's, if you really want it, because it's part of it, you've really got to pay for it yourself. And that sounds quite harsh. So
no, I quite like that. So there's an analogy for us, like in Canada and in some places of America, to become a firefighter, they have to pay for their LGV, they have to pay for their rope rescue, they have to pay for their first couple of levels of firefighting basics, for want of a better description. And I think it's very important because it filters out a lot of the people that don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And it filters out people that are just looking for a convenient, potentially better paying thing. But then once they get into the sector, if they're not really got skin in the game,
yes,
it's not going to be good for the sector
and
as a whole.
And I think you're right. It is about having skin in the game. That's the big thing. Is you're not just going and doing it as a bit of fun. You're really committing to it, even though it is designed for fun.
Yeah.
When you're doing that, and I think that's actually very important. So that skin in the game is important.
So 29, 30, when you first qualified.
Yeah.
you'll have started to get an appreciation, maybe even earlier than that, about the level of your procedures and processes. Again, we talk about risk, the risk of getting something like that wrong in an environment where we as humans do not belong. We shouldn't be at the bottom of the ocean. We shouldn't be in the sky either. We're invading that space. We're guests. So we're constantly trying to check ourselves to make sure we're safe. So how early on did you become familiar with things that had gone wrong? Because sometimes the best way to learn is to see what's happened in the past and not repeat the errors, hopefully.
Oh, very quickly, actually.
Yeah.
In fact, as I was an enthusiast about aviation, I'd attended air shows in the years prior to that, and in fact, sadly, had witnessed a fatal aircraft accident. I've witnessed another accident which wasn't fatal but was very significant. So
it's hard not to have a fatal accident when it comes to air, because in a car you can come to a rolling stop. Even in a boat, you could hope you can do the same. And for us, we can just leave the risk environment.
Yeah.
The risk environment, to get out of it, has to be a strategic retraction, because you've got to find your way back to the ground safely.
So, yeah, I mean, actually people assume that when anything goes wrong in an aeroplane, it crashes. It couldn't be further from the truth, actually. There's so many things that might happen that actually are perfectly manageable and survivable and all that sort of stuff. So it's far rarer than you think. But certainly I think so. I was aware of that, and obviously one of the things that happens when you go into aviation, you buy the magazines. Even if you go into any old bookshop or newsagents, you can buy aviation magazines, and at the back of them, the ones for general aviation, there'll be I learnt about flying from that, or there'll be a list of the latest accident reports. So from the day that you start learning to fly, you start to read the accident reports, and it becomes very much part of the culture that we do that. And it's often said that and it's probably the same in firefighting, that the rules that we use today are written in the blood of people who've gone before us. Yeah. So there is an element of reading those and thinking, oh, wow, that's stupid, I wouldn't do that. And then you go out and you do stuff and you think, hang on a minute, actually, if that had gone this way instead of that way, I could have ended up in the same position. Yeah. And so, one thing you have to learn very quickly is humility. No matter how good we are, how good we think we are, we can easily be the weak link.
We often are.
Yeah.
Human error. We're so complex, and we've got so much going on in our own personal lives. We're significantly less reliable than something that's been purpose-built and has one thing to do.
But interestingly, the work, a lot of the charity work I do now, which is around the science of human factors, when you talk to human factors experts, they will say to you, oh, no, Martin, it's not about, human factors isn't about human error. It's about designing the system so that we can optimize human performance and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, that's true. And academically, that's wonderful. But when you're sitting there in a real situation, it's about saving your ass, keeping alive and not screwing up. Yeah. And so for me, the science really, whether you're optimizing the efficiencies or whatever, is just about trying to make it easy to get it right. And it's about not just about the systems, but it's about how you behave and what you do that makes the difference. And having that awareness of your own ability to mess up is really important, I think.
You sit, and that's why I wanted to sit down with you today, because you sit in a very unfortunate but perfect eye of a storm, where you cross the bridge between public sector, private sector, and the weight of what's happened to you in your own personal circumstances gives you such an incredibly unique lens through which to view this. And I often say as well, I'm more of a leadership or a risk plumber. And I mean by that is I've learnt in the trenches a little bit, where if you get it wrong, somebody genuinely did get hurt, which is detached, as you alluded to there, from, with the greatest of respect, the armchair theoreticians of we from the data we've gathered, our best assumption is that this would be the most likely, and actually we've actually got a lot of data that would support that. And you're like, yeah, I appreciate that. I've been sat there though when somebody next to you goes, oh shit, I don't know what to do, or actually that it's the right decision, just do it.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh yeah. So very different lens through which people are viewing it from. So looking through that lens, after Elaine had passed, how quickly did your mindset shift from I'm going to say a victim mindset, and there'll always be a heavy level of emotion, and I'm sure there's been several times where you've had to have that self-awareness of, am I just seeking vindication, or am I just, because maybe you did, I don't know, listening to you, it doesn't sound as though you wanted to get finger pointy, and I know people that were involved in it are still operating in the profession today, so you were never seeking vindication in that respect. But how soon did your mindset shift from, but I don't understand what, I know you're saying a lot of words to me, and I consider myself to be quite an intellectual, you're a professional pilot, I consider myself to be well educated to an extent. Surely I should be able to comprehend what you're saying here, and there's a lot of holes I need filling in here. When did your mindset shift to that?
I think while Elaine was in intensive care, there was a lot of time, and clearly there was, I say nothing happening, but there was nothing happening, so I had lots of moments of reflection, and I'd had a conversation with the head of the intensive care unit, and they knew what I did for a living, and I talked about, how we investigate, and I just assumed that would be the same in Elaine's case. And and I said to him, I said, I just hope that when you investigate this, there might be some lessons that can be learned. I said to people, I'm 99.99% sure that nothing bad was done, nothing wrong was done. But at the same time, you kind of think, but yeah, as a professional, you'd want to learn. You'd want to know, is there anything we can learn from this? And maybe the answer is no. That's fine. I get that. And he just said to me, well, we won't investigate, not unless you sue or complain. And he really wasn't being nasty. He was just saying, look, Martin, this is how it is. This is, it was one of those things that just happened. It does happen from time to time. The emergency was unexpected. They did all the right things, and we wouldn't routinely investigate those. And that for me was where it changed, because
that would trigger me.
Absolutely, yeah. Because again, if you think about it, having grown up in aviation with all these accident reports, we investigate not to blame but to learn. That's the real drive here, because we want to make it safer for the next person and the next whoever.
Today's podcast was brought to you by our friends over at Willingwood Watches. On the 27th of April, Willingwood Watches launched their new limited edition watch, the Bronze Triumph Jubilee. This was launched to celebrate the Queen's Jubilee this year, and it's the first time ever they have produced a bronze version of their beloved Swiss-made Triumph collection. They are using specially repurposed purple hose, that's easy for me to say, and still keeping it in keeping with the bronze Swiss-made chronograph watch. There is no better way to commemorate the Queen's Jubilee with that plum violet, but of course you can get your combination of the straps as well. They've got the red, the blue, the yellow, the green. I'm sure you are all well aware of Willingwood Watches. They make those incredible luxury watches from upcycled firefighting equipment. They have been with us since the very origins of the podcast, and you can find out more from them by heading over to willingwoodwatches.com. Now back to the show. I always think science is a lovely analogy for that as well, because it's celebrated when you manage to disprove something.
Yes.
Because everybody's better off.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, thank goodness you helped me see a flaw in this idea. This wasn't my idea.
Yeah.
I was just the one that came upon it. But there's a detachment from, was there a fault versus was it your fault?
Yeah. But what happened then after Elaine died is I went to the chief exec and basically said, this is how we investigate in aviation. I gave her terms of reference. I didn't know if they were correct, but what I thought the terms of reference would be, and said I'd like the same to be done for Elaine. And, I emphasised this isn't about blaming. This is just about learning, and maybe there's nothing we can learn. And what I didn't know was that after my conversation with the head of the intensive care unit, he'd gone to the chief exec and he'd said, I think this guy's going to ask for an investigation.
Just raise a flag here, just in case, just heads up.
And he'd also had a conversation with a friend of his who happened to be the president of the Association of Anaesthetists of Great Britain and Ireland, a guy called Professor Mike Harmer, and had said to Mike, would you be prepared to do an investigation if we asked you? And Mike said, yeah. So what happened is that basically the chief exec had kind of already been warned, and I suppose it was easy for her just to say yes. But not only that, what I didn't click at the time was actually they didn't know how to respond. Now, today there's lots of protocols and procedures, but this was such a rarity of that somebody would ask for this, that she was just like, yeah, okay. And it was an interesting conversation because she said something which, again, has stuck with me to this day, and I think is very valuable, that really any chief exec in the NHS, particularly, especially in bearing in mind some of the things that have gone on recently, but also in any organisation should bear in mind, because I could see that she was thinking, Martin's going to try and sue the pants off us or something like that. And I said, I want this investigation. And I could see her, almost that fear in her eyes, or what I thought was fear. And I said, look, I don't want to sue or anything. I don't want to. And she just stopped me dead. She cut me off. She said, Martin, let's get the investigation done, and then what will be, will be.
Okay.
And I thought that was such a powerful thing. At the time, I didn't really register it, but now when I think about it, because so often I come, particularly in my voluntary work with the NHS, I will talk with boards and chief execs who've had an incident, and they say, we went straight and talked to the press, and we told them that how this wasn't possible and that wouldn't have happened like that. And I remember one particular one. It was actually a very sad accident. 4 teenagers had died in a vehicle on a particularly dangerous piece of road at night, and there were claims that the ambulance service hadn't turned up quick enough, and if they had, they might have lived. And literally, this accident happened about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and at 6 in the morning, the chief exec of the trust was on the television saying that's definitely not the case. We could see the ambulance went here, And I met the board, and I said to them, how could you say that? What you should have said was, we want to understand what happened, and if anything can be learned. We don't have the full facts at the moment, but when we have them, we will let you know.
Yeah.
It's that, that desire to learn is what unites, potentially unites the relatives or the family and the organisation and the staff immediately involved. But so often it's not united. It's an organisation, again, particularly the NHS, where it becomes very defensive, where it's about reputation management, perhaps just subconsciously, and it creates a second harm.
Unfortunately, though, haven't they? And to an extent, and that's not to give them an excuse or a way out, but
Yeah,
there are a lot of opportunists.
Yeah, you know what? It's really hard to understand. You can understand a commercial body being worried about their brand or whatever it might be. You can understand that almost. But when it's a government organisation I cannot understand reputation management unless it's maybe for the purposes of national defence, which is a very extreme situation. Yeah. But day to day, it just doesn't make sense. A friend of mine, a patient who also suffered harm herself by the name of Susanna Stamford, when asked about, why is it difficult to learn from incidents in healthcare, her one-word answer is fear. And it is something about the culture of the organisation that even if you're the chief exec of an ambulance trust, you still work for somebody in the NHS, and that person will be saying, how did you mess up? How did that happen? And it creates that culture, which is really not helpful.
It also limits the person's ability to, again, I know you've alluded to, I'm effectively paraphrasing, the person's ability to learn, but also the person's ability to just get a better understanding of what the current status quo is. So we have this in the emergency services, and you use that word fear, and again, it kind of alludes to the sheer creation of the podcast, is that there should be no fear in us discussing stuff that's already happened, or what we do as a day-to-day living. But the very fact that you and I both sit here not representing, not that we don't feel comfortable, but it gives us the most freedom for us not to talk about who we work for, because there is an aspect there that there is still an element of fear that we may share part of our professional job that may not be in alignment with the corporate structure. But at the end of the day, they trust us enough, A, to fly a plane, not me, but B, you trust me to go out this evening and potentially be in charge of a house fire or a car crash or whatever. You're not going to trust me to talk about it as though I'm going to... If I commit professional suicide, it's going to be of no real concern to you, but it's the reputational damage you fear I'm going to do there. And that stops me learning to an extent, unless I want to do something like this and have conversations with people where I can empower myself and share some of the really valuable knowledge that you're sharing with us today. So moving into reflecting back on the human aspect. So through aviation, you had seen that these investigations bring to light not just, oh, the bolt was loose, and yeah, we can check the schematics and we check the data sheets, because that's probably the easy grab when we look at things like this. And it's the same for us. They'll impound equipment, they'll impound a breathing apparatus set and go, was it damaged air? Was the cylinder damaged? Okay, no. And then flipping that lens to what were the human aspects involved in this scenario. If we could start first with maybe one or two examples of where the human behaviour start of training, and again my terminology is going to be all over the place there, where that first started in aviation, when a focus was given to that, and sort of your first understanding of CRM and the human factors. Today's episode is supported by our good friends over at Duty Crew Coffee. Now, as you're probably aware, coffee is the most popular drink worldwide, with over 2.25 billion cups of coffee consumed every single day, and over 70 million of those in the UK alone. Most of this is consumed in our crew rooms, our watch offices, and by our emergency services frontline staff. So when you're getting together around the mess table, don't be drinking no nasty ass cheap coffee. Nobody likes that guy that brings the cheap stuff. Life is too short to be drinking crap coffee. So if you head on over to dutycrew.co.uk or click the link in the podcast below, you'll be able to jump on over and see the Duty Crew coffee products. They come in 227 gram oversized high quality recyclable standard pouches, and they are individually wrapped 10 gram coffee bags. They're quick, mess free, convenient. They have a one-way degassing valve, which is an absolute must for storage of freshly roasted coffee. You can get the 20-pack response bag. They've got the HQ, they've got the No Duff, they've got the Unity, the Decaf, and of course all of their products are Rainforest Alliance certified, Fair Trade Foundation, and most importantly, they taste freaking epic. I started drinking Duty Crew about 2 months ago, and then when I fell in love with it, I got in contact with them and they came on board with the podcast. So jump on over to Duty Crew Coffee if you want some of the good stuff. Now back to the podcast.
Where do we start on that one?
It's like 10 questions in one. Sorry, I'm terrible at that.
So I think I'll just go back to previously what you were talking about first, because I think for me actually I'm very lucky because where I work actually incredibly supportive of the work I do in healthcare, and I've been able to bring some of that back into the organisation. But
that's changed though since when you first started? Not necessarily with this particular company, but
so the organisation I'm with now is very supportive, and actually I'm very lucky because. But the reason I keep them out of what I do, if you like, I keep them away from it, is actually it gives me a much greater freedom sometimes, because it gets very political when you're working with the NHS, and I have to have some very tough conversations with politicians at times, which is quite exciting. So it's quite nice to have that kind of
the freedom to tell them what they need to know.
Exactly, yeah. But I think so. Going back to the CRM issue and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of terminology which is worth explaining. But very early on in aviation, it became obvious, and we're talking World War I here, that actually, World War I, you had various aircraft fighting with each other, but actually far more people were dying because of accidents than enemy action. And there was this big thing about pilot error. There's obviously pilot error going on. And as aviation went on, started to discover that there were things that could drive that error. So an example would be in the late 30s, the Americans built the Boeing B-17 bomber, the Flying Fortress, as it was known. So this is a bomber that's bristling with guns for self-protection. But it was very advanced. It had quite complex systems. And the prototype actually crashed, not on its first flight, because just as it got airborne, it suddenly pitched up, lost lift, it stalled and crashed. And what had happened is when the crew were preparing it for flight, they accidentally left a lock in the flight controls that were designed to stop the flight controls moving around on the ground unnecessarily in strong winds, and they forgot to take it out. So the first lesson here was, okay, this aircraft's too complex, maybe we need to use a checklist. And that's something that we're very familiar with. But that incident has been talked about, for example, by health professionals like Atul Gawande, the American surgeon, who's written extensively about it and about how we can learn from checklists. And he's written a book called The Checklist Manifesto. But what it misses is the big lesson here, because the big lesson that the Boeing B-17 bomber taught us was that when it did come into service and they were training pilots for it, they found that pilots were making a common mistake. So this aircraft had retractable undercarriage and it had retractable flaps. And sometimes they were moving the flaps when they should have moved the gear, and sometimes they were moving the gear when they should have moved the flaps. And it kind of ruins your day, and it kind of ruins a very expensive aircraft. So what happened is they asked an engineer to look at this, and what he did is he noted that on this type there were a large number of accidents of that sort. He looked at a very similar type with retractable gear and retractable flaps, and he noticed there were very few accidents of that sort. And clearly the pilots were of the same kind of training, so it couldn't be stupid pilots. And what he discovered was on the type that didn't have many accidents, that the lever that moved the gear, the lever that moved the flaps were not next to each other, and they were different in their design. When he looked at the Boeing B-17, the levers were the same and they were next to each other. Yeah. So he said, well, maybe there's a design issue here. And indeed, that's where kind of the science of human factors and ergonomics really came into aviation, because now it kind of told us we could design something that made it easier to get it right or harder to get it wrong. And even today on the jet I fly, which all the switches, virtually everything in the flight deck is an electric switch. So you could just design all the switches to be identical. The lever that moves the gear is still placed, it's towards the front, it's to my right-hand side. I've got to stretch slightly to reach it, which is deliberate because it doesn't want to be an easy reach, it wants to be in thoughtful reach. And it's shaped like a wheel, feels like a wheel, it's painted black like a tyre. If I want to move the flaps, I have to move my right arm back behind me to a lever that is shaped like a flap, is nice and smooth. And so even on an electric plane where those switches could just be designed really simply, they've got this complex switching that is designed to make it both easy to get it right and hard to get it wrong. And when we talk about systems, and it doesn't matter, what business you're in, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a firefighter, whether you're a pilot, whether you're a receptionist in an insurance company, doesn't make a difference. You want to have systems there that help you to get it right and make it easy to get it right and hard to get it wrong. And that's really the science of human factors and ergonomics.
I think an easy example, sorry to interrupt, for just the public, just to give them a connection, fuel pumps, petrol, diesel. Do you know what I mean? You see certain things now that will have gone, you can't put a diesel one in. It won't allow you to put it in because we recognise that we can just go, oh, why are people so stupid these days? Yeah. And we go, well, yeah, okay, that's not controllable. And if you believe they are stupid, fair enough. But also the cognitive load of people, from life stress to social media to whatever it may be, to trust them to get that right. Not trust, but just, design it to remove the error. We just had some firefighting branches come out from a company, Rosenbauer, in fact, that we interviewed the other day. And the old branches were circular and they had a very small fin so that you should know when you're at an effective gas cooling level. The new ones are rectangular. So before, where you're like, people are like, oh, but you shouldn't feel it and should be able to see it. And you're like, it's freaking dark and smoky and I've got big fat gloves on. I don't know where the thing is. Whereas this one, click. Yeah. I'm at 90 degrees. It's rectangular. It's not square, so I don't know if I'm 9. It's that. And that, again, alludes to that perfectly.
Absolutely.
Just remove it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's where kind of human factors and ergonomics is really good. 90% of the science, I would say, is about those systems, whether it's IT systems, equipment, tools, processes, doesn't matter. But the other 10%, and this is where aviation really learned, was in the 70s, 60s, 70s and 80s, aircraft were technically much better, ergonomically well designed. Not as good as they are today, but certainly getting better. But accidents were still happening. And what happened was that in fact, I'll give you a very good example. There's a very famous accident, United 173 in 1978 in Portland, Oregon, where a DC-8 airliner, a 4-engined airliner with 3 crew on board, captain, co-pilot and flight engineer, was on approach. They went to put the gear down, the undercarriage down, but they didn't get the indications it was down safely. So quite rightly, they abandoned the approach. They went into a holding pattern, circled, while they troubleshooted the problem. And they went through all the drills, and basically after 15 minutes, they recognised that actually the gear was safe. It was locked in position. It was the indicator that was the issue. So they did everything right, but unfortunately what then happened was, even though at that point you'd say, well, you've still got enough fuel here, let's just start the approach, the captain started to become more concerned about, well, what happened if the gear isn't safe? We probably have to evacuate, so started to brief the cabin crew. And during this time, the engineer and the co-pilot are watching the fuel, and the fuel is dwindling. And they're calling it out. They're saying, we've got 5,000 pounds of fuel. We've got 3,000. Now, these are very low levels of fuel. We've got 3,000 pounds of fuel. And they'd be asking each other, how's the fuel doing? At one point, one of them said to the captain, how's the fuel doing? And the captain looked at the gauge and just read it. It said it was 3,000 pounds. But there was no thinks bubble that said, hang on, that's really low. And in fact, what happened is they spent so long getting ready for the very, very remote possibility of an evacuation that the engines started to flame out. And it was only when the first engine stopped that the captain said, what's going on? And at that point, suddenly realised they were running out of fuel. But it was too late. They were too far away from the airfield, and they didn't actually make it to the airfield. They turned towards the airfield, but all the engines flamed out and the aircraft crashed in the suburbs of Portland. 10 people died. Actually, nobody on the ground, miraculously, although it wiped out 2 houses because they were empty. But so what had happened, if you like, is the captain had become fixated on this problem, while the rest of the crew were trying to raise their concerns. And so what the accident report talked about was the need for participative management. And what we've done since 1978 is we have worked really hard to start to instill the understanding of what that is. Now, it's been trained in what we call crew resource management. Healthcare, some call it team resource management. There's all sorts of different names. But it's a set of techniques you can use, and it's been re-enhanced in the late 90s by what we call non-technical skills. These are behaviours. So we've identified what behaviours support participative management. And in fact, it's become very sophisticated now. So we now have what we call evidence-based training in aviation. And evidence-based training basically looks at accidents, it looks at incidents, it looks at safety reports, it looks at what happens in simulators when we're trying to train people. And what it does is it identifies which behaviours are more likely to lead to success and which behaviours are more likely to lead to failure. So if you behave in a certain way, it doesn't guarantee success or failure, but it gives you a much greater chance. And what we're focused on, I'm now a training captain, so I'm training other people to both fly the aircraft, but examining them as well and coaching them, is we focus on those behaviours. We want to see certain behaviours because we know they're much more likely to lead to not only a good outcome, but the optimum outcome.
A quick reminder for all of our listeners of our monthly giveaway. Now, as part of our partnership with Hikes, Rosenbauer and Tallyman, we give away that little bit extra to our podcast listeners every single month. You can get 2 personalized BA tallies. These are hardware and they've got your own name on them, they've got your own service number on them, and they have the podcast logo on the back. And then for the juicy stuff, Hikes give away a pair of their incredible footwear. And some of the stuff is pretty expensive stuff, to be honest with you. We try and switch in and change it every month. We are guided by the gods of Hikes to make sure we are giving you exactly what you need for that time of year. So it might be boots, it might be trainers. And then once every quarter, our good friends over at Rosenbauer are giving away their Boros B5 Firefighting boots as well. So to be in with a chance to win, jump over to our social media platforms or YouTube, where you need to tag a member of the emergency services in the post, be following our page, and you will be in with a chance to win at the end of every single month. Back to the show.
We said before we came on about how the soft skills become the hard skills. That must, for anybody that's gone through a period of professional training to gain a role, so much of the focus initially is on developing the technical skills, for want of a better description. It must be, and again, it probably speaks to your professional capability and the fact that you can cross this bridge, because you're very quickly getting into behaviours. We use the word behaviours. Behaviours exist in all of your life.
Yes.
So it's likely also I'm going to give you a reflection of the way that you're acting maybe with your friends or maybe with your family. And we all appreciate we act differently at work than we do at home. How difficult is it and how receptive are people? I'm sure they're very receptive of it now. They're very aware of that it's a requirement for your role. But I'm using mine as an example. It's harder to coach people in behaviours because the focus has always been so heavily on we'll use the word competency, which is very much a technical based. Can you do these 5 things? In which case you're a professional pilot. In which case you're a competent firefighter. You can do the job. You're a paramedic. But again, paramedic's a great example. So much of the ability for that person to do the job successfully relies on those behaviours. So, what are some of the methods you said about there being, methods and this evidence-based approach to help try and encourage people to adapt their behaviours? I would imagine people cling quite strongly onto their behaviours, and you could quite easily find somebody become quickly defensive, maybe about because they're very at the end of the day, it's just your opinion, Martin, and you'll go, no, well, it's evidence based and blah blah blah. Yes, you just think I may be out that way, but that's not actually the way I saw it. I thought that person was very receptive of the way that I was behaving with them. How do you navigate that?
That's really good question. But so it's much more than that. So we have. Every airline will have its version, but there is an international standard of these. We call them areas of competence, actually. And then within that, there are observable behaviours. So how do we know the person is competent at this? What behaviours are we looking for here? What outcomes are we looking for? But generally, it's behaviours. So when you go to start learning in aviation, you will be assessed against the same sort of framework. When you are selected for an airline, you will be assessed against that framework. You're not going to be perfect. Nobody's perfect. But you're being assessed. Do they show predominantly these behaviours? We're not really interested in your personality type. That's for psychologists.
It's not Myers-Briggs stuff, no.
Exactly. We want to know your behaviours. And the important thing is then when you go through your training, we are looking for those behaviours. We're developing those behaviours. Now, you have a choice. You don't have to demonstrate certain behaviours, but then we don't have to employ you. Yeah, and that sounds really harsh, and it's not. It is actually, we pride ourselves on trying to be warm, coaching approach. But there comes a point when, somebody's saying, I'm trying to do it and I'm struggling, where you say, okay, I'll give you support. But somebody says,
Are you coachable? Are you receptive?
Yeah, you know what, I don't believe you. I know it's evidence-based, but it doesn't work for me. Yeah. Well, if it doesn't work for you, that's fine, but it doesn't work for us then if you're not like that. So there's a constant process here. So every 6 months you're in the simulator being assessed. Every 2 years, or depending on how it's done in the airline, 1 year, you're being assessed out working with crew and passengers on a flight. And we're constantly looking at those. You're never going to be perfect. That's the important thing. We can always improve. But generally we want people who are receptive, who are trying to use those behaviours. And as I say, if it did come to the point when somebody really wasn't receptive, then they're just not right for the industry. And I've seen a big change, in 25 years of commercial flying. I've seen a big change now, and what might have been acceptable, 25 years ago, when we almost had that kind of maverick, Top Gun, macho approach, where you were
very much echoes the emergency services.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm the expert. I know everything. Yeah. To really now, where we've really got this idea that you might know a lot, but first of all, you're capable of getting it wrong under pressure, and humans randomly get things wrong that you can't always predict. But secondly, you have a team around you. You have people around you who can help you not get that wrong or help correct it when it goes wrong. So how do you use those? And so much of, particularly when I'm training brand new captains, for example, you'll get a brand new captain and they're in the flight deck and you're waiting to depart, and I'm sitting there pretending to be their co-pilot, if you like, but I'm there as a trainer. And maybe there'll be a problem. The cabin crew will come in and say, hey boss, we've got a problem in the cabin here with a passenger, etc., etc., etc. And you can see this brand new captain immediately springs into action. They want to help. They say, right, okay, well, I know there's a rule about this, so hang on, let me just get the books. And I tell you what, why don't you do this and why don't you do that? And their cognitive capacity is taken up. And actually afterwards I'll say to them, you know what, you spent 5 minutes on that. I said, do you know how I'd handle it? When that cabin crew member comes in and says, hey boss, I've got a problem, I turn around and say, how would you deal with it normally? Or what would you like to do? Or how can I support you? Or what do the books tell you about how to deal with it? Because the chances are very high they know the answer. The chances are actually very high they know the answer far better than you. Now, they might not, at which case you do have to get involved or whatever, but actually that ability just to turn to somebody. And it's the same when you've got 2 experienced or 3 experienced flight crew working together, because the captain isn't always the most experienced, will have had a lot of experiences, but may not be the most experienced. It doesn't matter. Even if you've got somebody next to you who's very junior, just turning to them with an open question when something happens and saying, hey, Sarah, what are your thoughts on this? Any thoughts? What could we do here? And then shutting up and listening. Because first of all, they might then, you've probably got a good idea in your head, but they might add to it and make your idea not just okay, but even better. But secondly, they might have seen something that you haven't. And I've experienced that. I remember just a year ago, I don't remember the specific technical issue, but we had a minor technical issue on the ground. We had a caution message, and I knew exactly what it was and I knew how to fix it. But I said to my colleague, I said, what's your thoughts on that? And he said to me, oh yeah, because it's this, this and this. And I sat there thinking, that's not what I see. He was right. He perceived something and noticed something that I hadn't. And just by taking that approach, there was no question. He didn't have to fight. He didn't have to get the courage to speak up because I hadn't even told him what I was thinking. Yeah. He just said, this is what I think. And for me, we have this big debate, particularly again in healthcare. And we saw it very recently with the tragic Ockenden report into, maternal deaths, baby deaths in Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital. Is this reference to the problem of speaking up. The problem, there's a problem, but the big problem is listening up. Leaders who want to listen. And I mentioned this to a medical audience once. I said the importance of asking open questions of your team before you say anything. Yeah. And one of them said to me, I totally agree, Martin, it's really good because it helps the juniors learn when you ask them the question. But that was missing the point. I said it's not about the juniors learning. This is about you learning. This, and as a leader,
from your ivory tower.
Yeah, and it's very relevant in a safety critical industry because we all end up in situations in a safety critical industry, whether firefighting or aviation, where sometimes we're faced with a situation that actually really is quite novel and complex. In other words, it's not just one failure or one weather issue, it's multiple. It's a bit of bad weather, it's a system failure, it's an air traffic, and you've suddenly got quite a complex problem to deal with. But in society generally, the pace of change, the pace of innovation is so difficult to keep up. And then you add a pandemic or a war.
It's just accelerating.
And
all of these technologies are colliding.
Yeah.
And like, bang, an atom of more creation, innovation explodes from it.
And you might be the most innovative, brightest entrepreneur, but you can't possibly have an awareness of how all these things around you might affect you. So the ability to just ask open questions is so powerful.
I've made several notes there as you were speaking. There's a few things I want to double click on. Open and closed questions is such a subtle but powerful change, especially when we spoke before about speaking with children and just anything like that. We'll try and find a notes to a link somewhere, but the difference between open and closed questions and how that can empower people's decision making and their own cognition and just stirring that grey matter versus you get perpetually frustrated because you train people, you condition them not to be able to make decisions. And then you get more frustrated and you have a belief that they're incompetent, which forces you to micromanage them more. And that self-perpetuating spiral goes down into a level of everything becomes reliant on you, and your cognitive load is less because it's full of all the other not menial, but all the other tasks that you could have empowered somebody else to do. There's a great book, Turn the Ship Around. I don't know if you've heard. Yeah, and I'm going to get the wording wrong. But
it's David Marquette, isn't it? The submarine commander. Yeah.
And a lot of his, the phrase he would give back is exactly as you were saying there, what's your intention? And they would say, my intention is this, and he would say something like, I don't know, carry on, or do it, basically, and not even if you think you know the answer, not forcing yourself to be the person that has to do that. I wanted to ask you about, we do a lot of things, tactical decision-making exercises and stuff like that, and there was something you said really significant there about the detachment that people have. I think you gave an example there of, observing something happening and asking someone else's opinion. There's a strange thing that happens when people think like incident commanders or leaders or whatever seem to have the fountain of all knowledge and all. Yeah. But it's kind of a trick because you spend so much of your time stood back. So like in a road traffic collision as an example, everybody's in there with their blinkers on, focused on the what's happening there, and you're stood back. You're seeing that holistic view of everything happening and how everything is happening simultaneously, but you're also able to mentally zoom in on what's that person doing. They're just, okay, where do I think they're going next? Okay, they're preparing to do the thing. They're getting the equipment ready for the next thing. Okay, that's going to work well with the other so-and-so. And you see the dance happen in front of you, which gives you a greater awareness of what you think should happen next. I want to try and find a connection to reference back, because jump me back to the nurses, for example, and Elaine's example. I'll let you carry on because there's a great connection there, and I know that's probably where you were going. Please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So in Elaine's case, when they'd anaesthetised her, an emergency occurred. They couldn't get oxygen to her, and she'd started to turn blue, so signs of hypoxia. The oxygenation fell to very low levels. I mean, basically she's being starved of oxygen. And the anaesthetist had started to attempt to intubate, put a flexible tube down her airway. The surgeon joined them, another anaesthetist joined them. They're all focused on Elaine, they're round Elaine, trying to intubate using a variety of techniques. But it became obvious in the inquest and with the review as well that we had, that actually the four more, quote, junior staff, the two anaesthetic assistants, the two nurses, were metaphorically and literally stood back. So they were doing some things under their own initiative. They were getting the tracheostomy kit ready. They were phoning intensive care. They could see this was deteriorating into an emergency called can't intubate, can't ventilate. And they were thinking ahead because they had that capacity. The three doctors, though, just as in United 173 with the captain, were fixated on the problem of intubation. But actually what needed to happen was to stop the attempts and perform that surgical access to the airway. But they were so fixated they couldn't do it. And as the nurses then tried to speak up, because they weren't invited in to do it, it was too difficult for them. It was they worked around these people. There was that informal and formal hierarchy. It was so. And it's interesting actually, because when experts have looked at this, human factors experts and accident investigation experts, they've all said, this is a failure of situational awareness. The three doctors didn't have situational awareness, but the four nursing and anaesthetic staff did have SA. So the situational awareness wasn't shared, which is true. But the concept that we spend a lot of time talking about now in aviation is something called workload management. It's one of our competencies for which we've got behaviours. So when something starts to go wrong or something different is happening, the first thing you want to do is to approach it calmly, methodically. And we have this great propensity as the human species to jump in and act. And the argument being actually when your cognitive workload goes up, you're better off just pausing for a moment, taking some breaths, counting even, or my preference, ask an open question. So for example, if the anaesthetist had turned around to the other staff in this situation and just said, look, just stop everybody. what can you see happening here? That would have probably been enough for somebody to say she needs a tracheostomy.
How to deliver that without condescension, though?
I think, and I actually, you know what? That's an interesting you say that, because
or appeared condescension.
The thing I love about where I work in aviation is a lot of the co-pilots I work with, a lot of the cabin crew I work with, are just so good at saying what they see. Mm-hmm. It might sound condescending. It doesn't matter. I don't care. Yeah. I just want to hear it. And it's that ability to say, it's not condescending, it's just saying literally, I think she needs a tracheostomy, or we're getting into a difficult airway here. We need to go we're almost at plan D on the protocol, which there was a protocol but wasn't accessed at any point by the doctors. Again, probably because of the fixation. It just needs that moment. And something that we try and teach, particularly our more junior co-pilots, is just say what you see. Doesn't matter how it comes out.
They do that on trains now, aren't they? Is this something you've explored or seen in any of your workings, where they call out what they're doing? As they're doing it, they call out, and they're like, platform clear and this, and every time they're doing their checks, they verbalise it.
Yeah.
And almost, I think it was Marilyn Monroe that also said, think in ink. This is the physical fact of writing things down.
Yeah.
Detaches you from it, and then allows you to observe it. Because if you think I'm thinking about what I'm thinking about, it gives you an ownership about what you're thinking about, and you don't want to disprove yourself. Whereas if you write down and go, it's 2:05, and you look at the clock and go, oh, it's not 2:05, it's 1:05.
Yeah.
Well, that's okay. Then what I've just written down is wrong, versus I'm wrong. And when people see it, say it, and then it allows somebody else to go, what did you just say?
Yeah.
And you went, oh, you're right. I just said it's 2:05. It's not even 5. I don't know why I just said that. But before somebody immediately does a life critical act, on the perceived fact that you say it is 5:05, it's not 2:05.
Yeah.
Your cognitive load is too much. We always get it where you look at the clock and you look down and you look at you're like, I keep looking at the clock, but I'm not looking at the time.
Yes.
I just keep going, I've referenced it. And I imagine the fuel was the same thing. To him, it may have appeared a remedial piece of information. Sir, what? I'm trying to fix a problem.
Yeah.
Just tell me freaking information I don't need to know right now.
Yeah.
You
need to kind of up the ante. And there's, again, healthcare, there's a lot of effort spent on training techniques for speaking up and how you do it and all that. I kind of like, I'm not really interested. I think you just have to say what you see, and then the person you're talking to, and it might be senior, might be junior, has to be able to take that objectively as a fact, okay, or as something to check. I think the other thing we're very good at now in aviation, we're getting better at, is we, and I'm sure it's the same with firefighters, we depend a lot on what we call our motor programs. So we automatically can do, 5 things at once, not because we're thinking about them, but because they're subconscious acts. But sometimes, that can be dangerous. So, for example, you go to put the gear down on an aircraft, it has a limit, a speed limit. You can't put it down below a certain speed. So, and if it's suboptimal to put it down at certain other speeds and things like that. So you just, when somebody says gear down and you reach across for that lever, as you reach across, you need to stop and think, what's the speed? Are we okay? Yes, we are. Right. So try to make those actions thoughtful is also important, but calling it out as well, just again, calling what you see, we're too fast.
And is that something you vocalise? So if they say gear down, would you go gear, speed is?
So some procedures do, some don't. We don't, but we try and teach that pause. We teach the look at it. We want to reduce the verbiage a bit, basically.
Yeah.
But I think everybody has in their head, I'd like to think, and certainly it depends what it is. I think there are certain checks which we do out loud and certain that we don't, but it's just trying to get that thoughtful moment before you act that's really important.
We have there's various simple examples I could try and give, but one of the first drills that people learn in firefighting is day one is just running around in your kit and all that sort of stuff. And then early on you do hose running, and then you move from hose running to working from a hydrant. So no, fire engines aren't even in the realm at this point in time.
Yeah.
You're just working off a hydrant. So for anybody, a pipe that sticks out the ground, I'm sure everybody knows what a hydrant is. We plug it in, we switch it on, we charge some water. And there's two sides to some hydrants versus on the back of a fire engine, you could have 6 outlets. And we try and condition that, okay, I've laid all the hose out. I'm going to couple it together as I go back towards the person that's going to charge it. And then I'm going to go water on line 1. I'm going to point at it. I'm going to point at the line because they might have 2 coming out. And it seems less significant there. But if you've got 4 lines coming out the back of a fire engine, you say water on and they reach for the wrong handle.
Yeah.
So it's that stage, but also some people say, and I try and encourage people to say, couples checked, water on, line 1, because I don't want you to put the wrong line on and kick, Sarah off the ladder that she's trying to climb down. She's got the hose over her shoulder. It's not charged, and that, that jet reaction is going to throw her off it. But secondly, I don't want you to switch this on if I haven't checked the couplings. Now, it's not your responsibility for me to check the couplings, it's my responsibility. But simply verbalising it stops you charging it. And to be honest, quite a heavy metallic object start flailing around, potentially hitting people, hitting vehicles, and effectively there's the water not getting to where it needs to go. We spoke a lot about behaviours there. What I want to do, I've got several notes there from books and stuff like that. I've learnt of and tried to use a model called SBI. Have you heard of SBI?
No.
So it's, I forget who it is and I apologise. I'll try and find and put it in the notes. Situation, Behaviour, Impact. So SBI. Okay. Because feedback is so hard for a lot of people in life. And I'm going to ask you, because I know I want us to talk about this chapters of Life's Perspective. You moved on now. You're happily with another partner. Feedback in the home is tough. Feedback at work is tough. So trying to have a way to do it, because people say, I've struggled to find the words, or Martin's never very receptive, or Pete, you don't seem to listen. A way to detach it I've always tried to use is the SBI. I forget where I learned it, but it's situation, and perhaps we could try it for the situation we're in right now, because I have several bad behaviours, as I'm sure we all do. One of which is I get so excited about the things. A way for me to temper it is I'll make notes rather than interrupting you. But even today I would have interrupted you far more than I would like. When I listen back to this, I'll hate myself. But we go situation, behaviour, impact. So situation, we were sat together today and Pete, you were so excited about some of the stuff that I was saying, or I could see your non-verbal cues of your eyes lit up when I said something and you were excited to show you were understood or show you'd heard me, that what you in fact did was start speaking before I'd finished speaking. Wonderful. But the impact of that was I didn't feel listened to, or I felt like you already knew what I was going to say, so it made me actually less interested in communicating more things further, because I didn't want to say something you already knew, and you gave me the impression that you already knew it, so actually you cut me off and I was going to say another 10 things. Maybe you thought I'd finished. And it's sometimes a lovely way to just say, look, you're not wrong, but the situation isn't personal. The situation is, we sat down here, this is the behaviour I saw you exhibit. And the beautiful thing about impact for me was always impact intended versus impact felt. Is my intended impact was, I wanted you to know that, hell yeah, Martin, high five, I agree, you're right, I'm so excited that you just shared that. But actually, what was the impact you felt? So is there any, when you're working with people on communication, assertiveness, some of the things that I know we spoke about before we came on, is there any way that you help people? Because obviously as a coach, you'll have your own effective way of doing it, but ideally you want people to be able to give this feedback in the moment when you're not there. Are there any methods you use? Is there any, because some people struggle to give feedback. How receptive are you if I was lucky enough to meet your partner this morning, I'm sure she gives you feedback on life, as you probably say. I know my wife certainly gives me feedback. How are some of the good ways we can give people feedback?
I think so what we try and do, we don't have a neat little thing like that, but I suppose we have what we call the training cycle, which is really where we try and get, the important thing is when something's happened, we try and get agreement, between you on what actually just happened. What did we see? How did you behave? Try and understand why that was. And then if it's in a more formal environment, for example, where you're examining a crew or something like that, or assessing a crew, it would be to say, okay, we've kind of got to an agreement on what happened. What would be, perhaps what outcome did that lead to, or could it have led to? What's the standard? What do we expect in that situation, or what might be a better way of approaching it, a more helpful way of approaching it? and then agreeing some action that's going to change that. So it's not really a neat little process as you've described, because I think there are many things, when we're assessing, for example, people in a simulated situation. It might be something very, very technical. It might be something purely around behaviour. It's probably a combination of the two, and you don't always know yourself until you start questioning people. But the thing I have learned is you've got to keep it simple, and people take away far less than you realise. So when it's a technical thing, like, do you realise that hose, actually you connected it that way, but had you connected it the other way, you could have connected it a lot quicker. People just remember that sort of stuff. That's just really easy it's building on an existing framework, if you like.
A marginal gain, if you will, rather than a whole new system.
Or a standard operating procedure they know, but they just forgot or misinterpreted one bit. When you're dealing with behaviours, it's often much more complicated. And as we were talking about earlier, it's often about your past life and all those sorts of things. It's often you don't realise the impact or even how you are perceived by others. And so that can be a lot more complex sometimes. That requires a lot of exploring. Possibly with, for example, if you're, assessing a crew, a captain, a co-pilot, what was happening for you at that point versus what was happening for you at that point, what was thinking, this is what were you saying, why were you saying that? There's actually quite a complex process. And I'll be honest with you and say it's so complex, you don't always get it right, You try your best, you try to help.
Working with people, isn't there? People are all beautifully different.
But what I have really learned is whatever you're doing around that, you've really got to understand why people are doing what they're doing, where they're coming from.
Because to them it makes sense.
Yeah, and that's
to some level. So just telling them they're wrong
Yeah.
is not going to help from their
Exactly.
perspective, from where I'm stood, Martin, from what I see.
Yeah.
Of course this makes logical sense. I'm not maliciously trying to be stupid. I'm not
Yeah.
trying to endanger people.
Yeah.
So don't just tell me I'm wrong, because it's not very helpful.
Yeah.
And
usually, usually people are pretty aware, I have to say, in our industry. But I think
in your industry especially, I'm not going to douse blame on people in the emergency services. I myself, let's just put it that way, I'm a knuckle-dragging firefighter. I am trying to exist. I'm trying to build a bridge between people in a different sector, such as yourself. I would argue are probably of a different level of emotional intelligence, and perhaps are more receptive to some of the things we're talking about. I would love, in my optimistic fairyland, to try and get to that position in the emergency services. I definitely think it's achievable, and I definitely think with the diversity of people that we're getting into the sector now, it's more achievable. But I don't want to leave other people behind as well. I don't want them to exist with I don't get all this newfangled whatever. I want to try and give them those takeaways. So it's so important for me to try and, as you say, keep it simple. Yeah,
it is about keeping it simple. It's about, when somebody goes out of here, what can they actually do?
What's actionable, yeah.
What can they do? And often it is, when it comes to behavioural things, it's often just, there might be 3 or 4 things that you discuss, but they're probably only going to remember one big thing, that if they did that, would be the marginal gain that helps not just X, but helps Y and Z as well. It's about finding that thing that's really helpful. But you do have to go towards, I hesitate to use the word because it's misinterpreted in healthcare, but you do have to go sometimes to the real root cause. Why are people behaving that way, or why are people doing that? And it's interesting, I was very lucky to work with accident investigators. I did a bit of training for some air accident investigation staff through Cranfield University a number of years ago around human factors. And we were just chatting at a coffee break about accident investigation. And when something goes wrong as a pilot, you look at it and you'd think, why on earth did they do that? And he said to me, Martin, the question you've got to ask is, why did it make sense at the time? Bang. Because until you ask that, you can't learn. Yeah. You can't learn. Because unless the person is is doing something, a deliberate action to cause harm, is a Harold Shipman, for example, unless they're doing that, then whatever they did at the time made sense to them. Where
were they stood? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In their mind, in their life, They were stood at this angle, and that's what they saw.
Yeah.
They didn't see the thing around the side. They didn't see the fuel. They didn't see the fire. They didn't see that. So from their perspective, whether that's an educational perspective, whether it's an experience perspective, or whether it's just the role they were doing that day, subconsciously, their view is limited. My view is limited.
Yeah.
Everybody's view is all limited to an extent of your own experiences.
Yeah. And I think what's also helpful and I often say this, when I've got trainees, for example, at work, is that I'll often, they'll maybe make a mistake on something or they'll feel really bad about it. Oh, I can't believe I messed that up or whatever. But I will often say to them afterwards, hey, you know what? I've done that.
Yeah.
I've done that. I've done a lot more stupid things over my life. And I've been very lucky that, I've always had a team around me and I've had systems around me that have supported me so that, that stupid little error doesn't become a big error. And that's really, I think, the trick, really. And that's why I go back to talking about open styles, participatory management, open questions, because it is about, we all make mistakes. What we want to do is to put things in place that help, ideally avoid those, but can trap or mitigate those things before they become bigger mistakes. And I think if there's one lesson we can really learn from aviation for other industries, it's that, defence in depth, if you like.
What I would love to do as we close, because you said there about people's life situations and why did that make sense and what would I've written down as you were speaking then as something I think I've heard Tony Robbins, and hopefully I don't lose anybody when I say that, because I appreciate for some people it's a bit high five, rah rah, but the idea of what would I need to believe for this to make sense? And it kind of brings me full loop, and what I'd love for us to close, your wife's been lovely enough to join us in the room, is that life continues, life has chapters, life continues beyond all of these things. And I'd love to just close on the fact that, and also maybe an aspect of post-traumatic growth in that, we spoke earlier about the cave versus the tunnel analogy. Life goes on.
Yeah.
These situations have also, in a morbid sense, empowered you to help a lot of other people. Your life itself has carried on. You've had many more experiences, holidays, new family, new life, new adventures, and you've experienced joy through what some people would consider to have been a cave they were never going to come out of. How has, if you could entertain me for a minute, how has, in a morbid sense, that situation changed and empowered you? We spoke about perspectives. How's it changed your perspective? Do you speak, behave? You've been able to help so many more people, and I want us to, as we close, reference where people can get a little bit more information about this. But how has, from everything we've learned and everything we've discussed, because I want to sell it to people, I want people to go on and not have to read the 27 books I've read to really see the empowerment that situations like this can give people.
I think the first thing to say is that it sounds easy to say it, but never give up. And what I mean by that is that after Elaine died, obviously I had 2 young children to bring up. And,
gave you a different purpose as well.
But I think the problem, it doesn't matter what you do, she's dead. And that's, it sounds awful to say, but that's true. So, but what I could do is never lose hope that actually I would have a good life. And more importantly for me, that the kids could have a good life. I didn't know what it would be like. I didn't know how I'd get there. I didn't know what I needed to do. I couldn't think ahead at that time. But I knew somehow I could get there. And it was a bit, I was asked about this one day while I was in the middle of it by one of my bosses. And he said to me, "How you doing, Martin?" And I said, I'm okay, He said, "I'll be honest with you, Martin." He said, "I thought you'd collapse."
Just implode.
And I thought, well, thanks for your support, John. But I said, to me, I said, this is like walking towards a mountain range. You haven't got any maps. You don't know how you're going to get through it. You know it's going to be difficult, but you've got no idea what's beyond that first mountain. There might be more mountains. There might be hundreds more. I have no idea. But I do know that one day I will be able to get me and the kids somewhere that is a good place and we can have a good life. And it is about making the most of what you've got and appreciating that. And I suppose what it did is it's given me an appreciation of the good things that I have. And it's also opened up an understanding that everybody has a story, that everybody has had something in their lives. You just don't know what it is. It might be something majorly traumatic. It might be something quite minor, but it has in some way shaped and driven their perspective of life. And understanding that is important. But I think the other thing, and I hope this gets to the point of what you were asking, is that there's a lot of talk about, we want to be happy in life, and people say it's actually about purpose. And the more I live it, the more I realise that is true. That having a meaningful life, doing something that it might be, I don't know, it might be that your hobby is pigeon racing, for example, and you want to, I don't know anything about the topic, by the way, but you might want to, really progress the sport, really progress the care of the birds. You might want, I don't know what, but if that's your meaning, that's great. It might be your meaning is just giving your children or your brother or somebody a better life. It might be it doesn't matter, but having that purpose, having that meaning is so important. And sometimes you've got to take a step, that never give up. The person who really reminded me of that was after Elaine died, I started to talk at conferences, and I was at one medical conference and I met this guy called Roberto Canessa. Now, almost certainly none of you will know who Roberto Canessa is, but you will know when I tell you the story. So he was the guy in the 1970s who was in the plane crash in the Andes where they had to choose to eat the dead bodies to stay alive.
Oh, God, I did read this.
And Roberto Canessa was the one who, they had no map. They were in the middle of the mountains. They had no idea, which way do you walk? There is no sign. This is, they didn't know they could work out the direction from the sun, but was it easier to go east or west? No way of knowing. And in the end, he just started walking and kept on going. And he said to me, Martin, never give up. And that is so true. Now, yeah, there are things in life where you do stop and give up because the emotional effort or the cognitive effort is too much. But if you really want something, keep going. You might not get what you want, but you will get somewhere. And that's true, in whatever you're dealing with.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And like you just said, it's, the analogy of that mountain range is just get to, even if you don't think that peak is where you want to be, that peak will at least give you a different perspective on where to go next. It's like walking to the corner of a street. If somebody's, but I want to go to a restaurant. Okay, but if we walk to the street and then we look left and we look right and we go, okay, now I've got a better appreciation of which way, but we can't see that from here. Yeah. Because to make it really simple, because there's bushes in the way, there's a house that we can't see what's around the corner. We can just see with what we have now. We can just deal with what we have now, and we've got to move forwards. Yeah. And moving forwards for you has manifested in something wonderful. I know I've only had limited interactions with your family, but certainly gives me an incredible amount of inspiration. Yeah. Thank you so much for today. I've made a myriad of notes. I just want to say thank you for sharing that with me. I appreciate, even from my work with TRIM and all that sort of traumatic stuff, I'm sure it's become easier over time, but also perhaps it's not healthy for people like me to continually bother people who have been through things and ask them to relive it. But you said about purpose and why. I'm not the best firefighter in the world. I don't think I ever will be, and I don't think there is such a thing with such an ever-changing dynamic sector that we work in, and perhaps the same same for yourself. But what I have realised is I'm so innately fascinated with people, and we spoke before we came on today. For me, this has come from a lot of my own self-reflection and then going down and down and down, keep mining into human behaviour. And I find so much excitement, passion in finding people such as yourself. And even, when you're a kid and you find like a stick in the garden and you want to run back and go, look what I found, what I found, because you think, and I know I'm not totally unique, there'll be more people that could benefit from your story and from the stories of so many people working on the front line, whether that's aviation, military, NHS, police, fire, whatever it may be. And I feel very privileged to be able to sit with people like yourself and in any small way create what I like to think of as an audible time capsule, that if somebody doesn't stumble across this for 10 years, there'll be people that get it in a few weeks, no doubt. But some might think, wow, I've just heard about this and I can't believe it's been there all that time. And I'd love to think that, I know your children are growing up now, but when my daughter's growing up or when other people are growing up, or people will learn from this. Yeah. And they'll hear it in a different way. Some people don't learn best from reading. Some people don't learn less from presentations. But for you to give the gift of this audio time capsule, I'm very thankful for that. And I'm thankful for your partner and for your children allowing us to invade your kitchen this morning to have this conversation. So.
No, well, thank you. Actually, I have to say it's been very fascinating, and you've dug into some areas that haven't been dug into a while, which has been really interesting for me, actually, because I find you very interesting and inspirational as well in what you're doing.
Okay.
And, and keep going, because there's lots of stories out there for us to learn from.
Millions. Thank you, Martin. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
The Firefighters Podcast is a global podcast seeking to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operators. Through a series of wide-ranging conversations celebrating those within our sector, we seek to encourage and support this incredible group of people. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield, and I speak with individuals from all walks of life who I sincerely believe can add value to or develop those who have chosen this life path. Please support your emergency services wherever you are in the world, and thank you for listening.